It was 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night when everything changed. I was working the closing shift at the Starbucks just off Highway 84, one of those isolated locations surrounded by nothing but empty strip malls and a gas station that closed at 10. The fluorescent lights inside had been dimmed to their lowest setting, casting long shadows across the cleaned equipment and stacked chairs. I was alone, as usual for the closing shift, just waiting to lock up and drive the 20 minutes home to my apartment. The last customer had left around 11:15, and I'd spent the past 30 minutes going through my closing routine. Machines cleaned, floors mopped, registers counted, trash emptied. All that remained was to finish wiping down the counters, grab my keys, and get out of there. That's when I heard the low, rumbling purr of a powerful engine approaching the drive-thru. Through the security monitor, I watched as a sleek black SUV pulled up to the speaker box. The vehicle was immaculate, expensive-looking, with windows tinted so dark they appeared to absorb light rather than reflect it, the kind of tint that was probably illegal in most states. The engine continued running, a steady, ominous growl that seemed to vibrate through the building's walls. I waited for someone to speak, but the SUV just sat there. No movement, no rolled-down windows, just the steady purr of the engine and complete silence from the speaker system. I glanced at the clock, 11:52 p.m. We'd been officially closed for nearly 2 hours, but I figured it was probably someone who'd been driving all night, maybe a trucker or someone on a long road trip who desperately needed caffeine. "Welcome to Starbucks," I said into my headset, trying to sound polite despite my exhaustion. "I'm sorry, but we're actually closed for the night. We'll be open again at 5 a.m. if you'd like to come back then." The response that came through the speaker made my blood run cold. "One tall caramel bloodbath," a male voice said, low and gravelly, with an unsettling calmness that made the word sound like a threat rather than an order. I laughed nervously, assuming I'd misheard. "I think you might mean a caramel macchiato, or maybe a caramel frappuccino. I'm sorry, but we're actually closed right now, so I can't make anything tonight." Silence. Dead, oppressive silence that seemed to stretch on forever. Then, barely audible through the static, I could hear breathing. Slow, deliberate, rhythmic breathing that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I tried again. "Sir, are you still there? Like I said, we're closed, but you're welcome to come back in the morning." Still nothing. The SUV remained motionless, engine running, windows black as night. I could feel my heart starting to beat faster as I stared at the monitor. Something about this whole situation felt deeply wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on what exactly was bothering me. Minutes passed. 5, then 10, then 15. The SUV never moved, not even an inch. No doors opened, no windows rolled down, nothing. Just that steady engine rumble and the occasional sound of breathing through the speaker. I tried turning off my headset, but I kept finding myself drawn back to the security monitor, watching that motionless vehicle with growing unease. By the time 30 minutes had passed, genuine fear had settled into my stomach like a cold stone. This wasn't normal behavior. Even the weirdest late-night customers eventually drove away when they realized we were closed. But this person, whoever they were, seemed content to just sit there indefinitely. I made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of just waiting for them to leave, I decided to go outside and tell them directly that we were closed. I grabbed the keys from behind the counter, took a deep breath, and headed for the door. The night air hit me like a wall of cold as I stepped outside. The parking lot was eerily quiet except for the SUV's engine and the distant hum of the highway. The only light came from a few scattered street lamps in the dim glow from inside the Starbucks. I approached the vehicle slowly, my footsteps echoing off the empty asphalt. As I got closer, I noticed something that made my steps falter. The windows, which had appeared completely black from inside the store, weren't just tinted. There were marks on the glass. Smudges. No, not smudges, handprints. Dozens of them, pressed against the inside of every window, like someone had been desperately trying to get out. But these weren't normal handprints. They were wrong somehow. Too small, too delicate, and they were smeared with something dark that had dried in streaky patterns down the glass. The back window had the most prints, overlapping each other in a chaotic pattern that spoke of panic and terror. I was still trying to process what I was seeing when the SUV's rear hatch suddenly popped open with a heavy, mechanical thud that echoed across the empty parking lot. What I saw inside will haunt me for the rest of my life. A woman lay bound in the cargo area, her wrists and ankles secured with zip ties that had cut deep grooves into her flesh from struggling. Duct tape covered her mouth, but her eyes, God, her eyes were wide with terror and pain and desperate hope when she saw me. Her hands were mangled, bloodied stumps where fingers should have been, and the duct tape couldn't quite hide the fact that her mouth was wrong too, swollen like something had been removed. She tried to make sounds, urgent, muffled noises that could have been pleas or warnings or both. Tears streamed down her bruised face as she looked at me with an expression of such desperate hope that it broke something inside my chest. That's when the driver's door opened. The man who stepped out was massive, easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed too broad for any normal human frame. He wore a long, filthy coat that might have once been tan, but was now stained with dark patches that I didn't want to think about. But it was his face that made me understand I was looking at something that had abandoned humanity long ago. He wore another person's face like a mask, crudely stitched to his own skin with thick black thread that wept constantly with infection and something worse. The stolen features didn't fit properly. The mouth was too wide, stretched into an impossible grin that showed too many teeth, and the eyes were just holes, black pits that seemed to absorb light. Blood and other fluids streamed down his neck from where the flesh had been improperly joined, creating a grotesque collar of gore around his throat. "Where's my order?" he asked, in that same calm, gravelly voice I'd heard through the speaker. But now I could see that the stolen mouth didn't move quite right when he spoke, creating a horrifying ventriloquist effect. Before I could react, before I could run or scream or do anything rational, his massive hand shot out and grabbed me by the collar of my work shirt. He yanked me toward him with inhuman strength, my feet leaving the ground entirely as he dragged me toward the drive-thru window. "I ordered a caramel bloodbath," he said conversationally, as if we were discussing the weather instead of my impending death. He slammed my head against the brick wall beside the drive-thru window, and stars exploded across my vision. The impact was so hard I felt something crack. Whether it was the brick or my skull, I couldn't tell. Pain radiated through my head as he grabbed my face and began trying to force it through the narrow drive-thru window opening. The window frame bit into my shoulders and chest as he pushed, clearly intending to crush me between the steel and glass. I could hear the woman in the SUV making desperate sounds, and somewhere in my pain-fogged mind, I realized she was trying to warn me about something. Panic gave me strength I didn't know I had. I managed to twist sideways and squeeze partway through the window opening, just enough to reach the manual window crank on the inside. With every ounce of adrenaline-fueled desperation I could muster, I grabbed the lever and yanked it down, slamming the window closed on his arm. He screamed then, a sound like metal grinding against bone, and began thrashing wildly. His arm was trapped between the window frame and the glass, and the more he struggled, the deeper the steel bit into his flesh. Dark fluid began dripping onto the floor inside as he clawed at the walls with gouges in the drywall. I stumbled backward, fumbling for my phone with shaking hands as I called 911. He was still trapped, still screaming, but now his voice had changed. The calm control was gone, replaced by rage and something that might have been fear. "You don't understand," he snarled, his stitched mouth working wrong around the words. "She's not the victim here. I am. She deserved everything that happened to her. She cheated on me. She broke our vows. She made me into this." I backed further into the store, keeping the phone pressed to my ear as I spoke to the emergency dispatcher. Through the window, I could see him still struggling, but he'd stopped screaming. Now he was just staring at me with those horrible black holes where eyes should be. "You can explain everything to the police," I managed to say, surprised that my voice worked at all. "You sided with the wrong person," he said quietly. "When I get free, I'm going to show you what a real caramel bloodbath looks like. I'm going to make you understand why she had to pay." The police arrived 12 minutes later, the longest 12 minutes of my life. It took 3 officers and 2 taser deployments to get him subdued and the window opened to free his arm. They had to call for backup and an ambulance for the woman, who was barely conscious but miraculously still alive. Later that night, Detective Morrison gave me the details that still give me nightmares. The man's name was David Kellerman, and he'd been on the run for 8 days after what the media would later call the Halloween torture case. His wife I was 13 years old when I met the thing that still haunts my dreams 15 years later. It was early October, one of those perfect Saturday afternoons when the leaves were just starting to turn and the air held that crisp promise of Halloween. My mom had finally agreed to let me go into Starbucks by myself, a small but significant step toward independence that felt monumental at the time. "Just get your usual, Ryan," she said, handing me her credit card from the driver's seat. "Hot chocolate and a cake pop. Be quick about it, okay? I've got errands to run." The Starbucks on Maple Street was busy but comfortable, filled with the usual weekend crowd. College students hunched over laptops, a few families with young kids, some elderly couples sharing pastries and quiet conversation. The familiar aroma of coffee beans and vanilla filled the air, and soft indie music played overhead. It felt like the safest place in the world. I joined the line behind a woman ordering something complicated with extra foam and half the usual sweetener. As I waited, I let my eyes wander around the cafe, taking in the autumn decorations that had recently been put up. Orange and brown garlands, plastic pumpkins, cardboard cutouts of falling leaves. It all felt cozy and seasonal. That's when I noticed him. In the far corner, near the trash bins and the condiment station, sat a figure that made me do a double take. At first glance, I thought it was some kind of promotional character, someone in a costume designed to advertise the cafe's seasonal treats. He was dressed as a giant cake pop, complete with a round, oversized pink head that represented the cake part and a long brown stick extending down from his body. But something was wrong with the costume, very wrong. The pink coating looked old and cracked, like paint peeling off a house that hadn't been maintained in years. What should have been smooth and glossy was instead dull and flaking, with chunks missing that revealed something darker underneath. The stick portion was frayed and dirty, wrapped with what looked like strips of fabric that might have once been white, but were now a sickly yellow-brown. The decorative sprinkles covering the pink surface weren't the bright plastic bits you'd expect on a promotional costume. They looked organic, irregular in shape and size, and I could swear some of them were moving slightly, like they were attached with something flexible. As I stared, I realized with growing unease that they looked like they'd been sewn on with individual strands of hair, different colors and textures, as if collected from multiple sources. What disturbed me most was how perfectly still he sat. Everyone else in the cafe was moving, shifting, drinking, talking, normal human behavior. But the cake pop figure remained absolutely motionless, like a mannequin or a statue. His arms hung at his sides without even the slight movements that come from breathing. His head was tilted at an angle that would have been uncomfortable for a real person to maintain. And no one else seemed to notice him. I watched the baristas behind the counter as they prepared drinks and called out names. Their eyes swept across the seating area regularly, checking on customers, but they never once looked toward the corner where he sat. The college students, the families, the elderly couples, none of them paid him any attention. It was as if he was invisible to everyone except me. The line moved forward, and soon it was my turn to order. The barista, a cheerful girl with purple streaks in her hair, smiled at me warmly. "What can I get you today?" A hot chocolate and a cake pop, please," I said, trying to keep my voice steady while sneaking glances at the corner. Sure thing. What kind of cake pop would you like? We've got birthday cake, chocolate, and lemon today. Birthday cake is fine, I replied, my attention divided between her and the figure in the corner. As she rang up my order and took the credit card, I found a table near the front window and sat down to wait. That's when the cake pop figure started moving. Slowly, deliberately, he turned his pink, cracked head in my direction. The movement was wrong somehow, too smooth, like his neck could rotate further than a human neck should be able to. When he was facing me directly, he raised one arm and began to wave. The gesture was horrible in its wrongness. His hand moved side to side in the classic hello wave, but it was too slow, too mechanical, like a broken toy winding down. His fingers crooked and uncrooked in a pattern that seemed intentional, almost like he was spelling something in a language I didn't understand. I looked around to see if anyone else was witnessing this, but the other customers continued their conversations and activities as if nothing was happening. A mother at the table next to mine was helping her toddler color in a Halloween coloring book. A teenager across the room was FaceTiming with someone, laughing at whatever they were saying. None of them showed any sign of seeing the figure in the corner. Ryan looked at the barista called, and I jumped, my heart hammering against my ribs. I collected my order and returned to my table, but when I looked back at the corner, the cake pop figure was standing. The movement had been silent, no scraping of chair legs, no rustling of fabric, nothing. He simply went from sitting to standing between one moment and the next. And then he began walking toward me. His movement was the most unsettling thing yet. There was no sound of footsteps on the tile floor, just a soft rhythmic squeaking that seemed to come from the costume itself, like rubber being stretched and released. The long stick portion of his costume dragged slightly behind him, making a subtle tapping sound against the floor tiles. As he got closer, I could see details that made my stomach churn. The cracked pink coating wasn't just peeling, it was moving, shifting like living skin. Some of the sprinkles were definitely made of hair, and I could now see that others were small, round objects that looked disturbingly like fingernails. A few appeared to be teeth. He approached my table and crouched down beside me, bringing his face, if it could be called a face, level with mine. This close, I could see through the cracks in his pink exterior to something underneath that I didn't want to identify. His breath, when he spoke, smelt like sugar that had gone bad, sweet but rotten with an underlying odor of decay. "I've got a secret menu," he whispered, his voice a rasping sound like sandpaper on wood. "Want to try the real flavor?" I forced myself to laugh, trying to play along with what I desperately hoped was just an elaborate prank. But he didn't leave. Instead, he stared at me with eyes that were visible through small holes in his costume. They were the wrong color, a yellowish tint with red veins that pulsed visibly, like I was looking at something infected. Slowly, with movements that seemed to cause his costume to crack and shift, he reached into a hidden pocket somewhere in his pink exterior. When his hand emerged, he was holding a small cake pop wrapped in wax paper, but the wrapping was old and yellowed, and something dark had stained it in places. "This one's special," he said, placing it on my table with a gentleness that was somehow more frightening than aggression would have been. "Limited edition, only for special boys who can see me." The way he said "see me" made it clear that my ability to perceive him was unusual, possibly dangerous. Before I could respond, he reached out and patted my head. His touch felt wrong through the costume, too cold, too firm, like being touched by something that was pretending to have hands. Then he turned and walked back to his corner with that same silent, squeaking gait. I grabbed my things and bolted for the door, not looking back, not caring if I seemed rude or crazy. The October air had never felt so clean and normal as it did when I burst out of that Starbucks and practically dove into my mom's car. "That was quick," she said, starting the engine. "Get everything you wanted?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. The wrapped cake pop sat in my hand like a small, terrible weight. I didn't tell her what had happened, partly because I wasn't sure she'd believe me, and partly because I was 13 and didn't want to lose my newly earned independence over what might have been my imagination running wild. When we got home, I went straight to our backyard, carrying my hot chocolate and both cake pops, the one I'd bought and the one the figure had given me. I sat on the picnic table near my mom's garden, trying to process what had happened while enjoying the normalcy of being in my own space. Our neighborhood had a small population of stray cats, and one of them, a skinny orange tabby with a missing ear tip, had wandered into our yard. I'd seen him before and had always felt sorry for him. He looked hungry, so I broke off a piece of my regular cake pop and tossed it to him. He sniffed it cautiously, then began to eat. While he was occupied with that, I stared at the wrapped cake pop from the strange figure. The wax paper felt wrong in my hands, too thick, too waxy, like it had been used before and rewrapped. There was writing on it, but not the usual Starbucks labeling. Instead, someone had written "For Ryan" in spidery handwriting that looked like it had been done with something other than ink. I made a decision that probably saved the cat's life and definitely saved my sanity. Instead of throwing the thing away, I unwrapped it and tossed it to the cat, figuring that if it was just a normal cake pop from someone playing an elaborate prank, no harm would be done. If it was something worse, well, at least I'd know. The cat approached the suspicious cake pop with interest, sniffing it carefully before beginning to lick at the candy coating. At first, nothing seemed wrong. The cat appeared to enjoy it, licking with increasing enthusiasm as the outer layer began to dissolve. Then I saw something that made me scream. As the pink candy coating melted away under the cat's tongue, something wet and glistening became visible underneath. At first, I thought it might be another layer of candy, maybe chocolate or caramel. But as more of the outer coating dissolved, I realized I was looking at something organic. It was an eye. Not a candy eye, not a plastic decoration, but a real human eye, complete with optic nerves still attached. The iris was blue, and the pupil dilated and contracted as it was exposed to light. My name is Jennifer Hayes, and I work at Morrison, Cole & Associates, a mid-sized financial consulting firm in downtown Portland. For the past 3 years, I've maintained the same lunch routine. Every weekday at exactly 12:30 p.m., I walk across the street to the Starbucks on 3rd Avenue, order my usual drink and wrap, and take a 20-minute break from the endless spreadsheets and client reports that define my professional life. It's a simple routine that helps break up the day. I order the same thing every time, a grande iced vanilla latte with almond milk and a spinach, feta, and egg white wrap. I like the consistency, the way the baristas have learned to recognize me, the brief escape from the corporate environment. It's become such an established pattern that sometimes my coworkers joke about setting their watches by my daily Starbucks run. The routine had been working perfectly until 3 weeks ago, on a Wednesday that started like any other. I walked into the Starbucks at my usual time, expecting to find my order waiting. The staff had gotten into the habit of preparing it when they saw me approaching, but this time something was different. My order was indeed ready and waiting on the pickup counter, with my name spelled correctly on the cup for once. But as I reached for my drink, I heard a voice behind me that made my skin crawl. "I'll have what she's having." I turned to see a tall man standing behind me in line, but something about him immediately set off every warning alarm my subconscious possessed. He appeared to be in his late 30s, wearing faded jeans that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks, and a pink hoodie that hung on his frame like he'd lost weight recently. The hoodie was wrinkled and stained, with dark spots around the cuffs that could have been anything. His appearance was disheveled in a way that went beyond simple casual dress. His dark hair was greasy and unkempt, sticking to his scalp in places and sticking out at odd angles in others. A patchy beard covered his jaw, growing in uneven clumps that suggested he hadn't shaved properly in at least a week. There was a smell emanating from him, not just unwashed clothes, but something deeper and more unpleasant, like meat that had been left out too long. But it was his smile that truly disturbed me. His lips were curved upward in what should have been a friendly expression, but it never reached his eyes, which remained cold and calculating. He was staring directly at me with an intensity that felt invasive, like he was memorizing details about me that I wasn't comfortable sharing. I frowned and turned away, assuming this was just some inappropriate attempted conversation or possibly hitting on me. I dealt with enough awkward encounters in coffee shops to recognize the signs. I picked up my order and headed for the door, hoping to escape before the situation could escalate. But as I walked past him toward the exit, he said something that stopped me cold. "You smell like fear and cinnamon." The words hit me like a physical blow. There was something deeply wrong about the way he said it, too knowing, too intimate, like he'd been studying me for longer than just the few minutes I'd been in the store. I didn't respond, didn't acknowledge the comment, just pushed through the door and walked quickly toward my car. The parking lot was mostly empty, just a few scattered vehicles belonging to other customers. I'd parked toward the back, away from the main flow of traffic, in a spot that usually felt safe and convenient. But as I approached my car and fumbled for my keys, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around and felt my heart drop into my stomach. The same man was now standing about 10 feet away from me, holding 2 brown paper bags in his hands. He hadn't said anything else, just stood there watching me with his head tilted to one side, like a curious dog studying something interesting. The bags he carried looked old and used, stained with dark spots that had soaked through the paper in places. They bulged with irregular shapes, and I could see that whatever was inside had leaked, creating wet patches that gave off a metallic smell I recognized but didn't want to acknowledge. "Don't be scared," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the empty parking lot. "You have such lovely skin." That smile spread across his face again, wider this time, showing teeth that were stained and uneven. His eyes never blinked if he stared at me, and I realized with growing horror that this wasn't a random encounter. This man had followed me outside deliberately. Fear does strange things to the human body. Sometimes it energizes you, floods your system with adrenaline that helps you fight or flee. But sometimes, especially when the threat is completely outside your normal experience, it has the opposite effect. It paralyzes you, makes your mind go blank, and your body refuse to respond to your increasingly desperate mental commands. That's what happened to me in that parking lot. My rational brain was screaming at me to get in the car, lock the doors, and drive away as fast as possible. But my body wouldn't obey. I stood there frozen, watching him approach with those horrible bags in his hands, feeling like I was trapped in a nightmare from which I couldn't wake up. He began walking toward me with slow, deliberate steps, never breaking eye contact. Each step seemed to echo in the empty parking lot, and I could hear the contents of his bags shifting and settling with wet, organic sounds that made my stomach turn. "I brought you a gift," he said, conversationally, as if we were old friends catching up rather than predator and prey in an isolated parking lot. He was less than 5 feet away when salvation came in the form of a car horn honking somewhere behind me. The sound broke whatever spell had frozen me in place, and suddenly my body remembered how to move. I lunged for my car door, yanked it open, and threw myself inside, slamming the locks down immediately. But he didn't try to stop me. Instead, he crouched down beside my window, bringing his face level with mine, separated only by a thin sheet of glass. This close, I could see details I wished I couldn't. The way his pupils were dilated despite the bright daylight. The small scabs around his hairline that looked fresh. The way his breath fogged the window when he spoke. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his voice muffled but still audible through the glass. I was reaching for my phone to call 911 when he reached into one of his paper bags and pulled out something that made me scream. It was a human thumb, severed cleanly at the joint, with red nail polish still visible on the nail. The cut was recent enough that I could see it wasn't completely dried, and there were tooth marks around the base where it had been gnawed on. He pressed it against my windshield, leaving a smear of blood and other fluids on the glass. "Don't you feel lucky?" he asked, his voice taking on an almost sing-song quality. His eyes never blinked as he stared at me, and I realized with growing horror that this wasn't a random encounter. This man had followed me outside deliberately. Fear does strange things to the human body. Sometimes it energizes you, floods your system with adrenaline that helps you fight or flee. But sometimes, especially when the threat is completely outside your normal experience, it has the opposite effect. It paralyzes you, makes your mind go blank, and your body refuse to respond to your increasingly desperate mental commands. That's what happened to me in that parking lot. My rational brain was screaming at me to get in the car, lock the doors, and drive away as fast as possible, but my body wouldn't obey. I stood there frozen, watching him approach with those horrible bags in his hands, feeling like I was trapped in a nightmare from which I couldn't wake up. He began walking toward me with slow, deliberate steps, never breaking eye contact. Each step seemed to echo in the empty parking lot, and I could hear the contents of his bags shifting and settling with wet, organic sounds that made my stomach turn. "I brought you a gift," he said, conversationally, as if we were old friends catching up rather than predator and prey in an isolated parking lot. He was less than 5 feet away when salvation came in the form of a car horn honking somewhere behind me. The sound broke whatever spell had frozen me in place, and suddenly my body remembered how to move. I lunged for my car door, yanked it open, and threw myself inside, slamming the locks down immediately. But he didn't try to stop me. Instead, he crouched down beside my window, bringing his face level with mine, separated only by a thin sheet of glass. This close, I could see details I wished I couldn't. The way his pupils were dilated despite the bright daylight, the small scabs around his hairline that looked fresh, the way his breath fogged the window when he spoke. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his voice muffled but still audible through the glass. I was reaching for my phone to call 911 when he reached into one of his paper bags and pulled out something that made me scream. It was a human thumb, severed cleanly at the joint, with red nail polish still visible on the nail. The cut was recent enough that I could see it wasn't completely dried, and there were tooth marks around the base where it had been gnawed on. He pressed it against my windshield, leaving a smear of blood and other fluids on the glass. "Don't you feel lucky?" he asked, his voice taking on an almost sing-song quality. "This could have been you. This could have been your thumb, but I chose someone else instead." With that, he straightened up, dropped the thumb into his bag, and walked away. He walked with casual confidence, like someone finishing a pleasant conversation rather than someone who had just terrorized a stranger with human body parts. I watched him disappear around the corner of the building, then sat in my car shaking for another 10 minutes before I felt stable enough to drive. When the police arrived 30 minutes later, they took the thumb as evidence and listened to my statement with expressions that grew increasingly grim as I described what had happened. Detective Rodriguez, the lead investigator, told me I'd likely encountered someone extremely dangerous. "We're going to need you to look at some photos," she said, "and I want you to consider staying somewhere else for a few days. If this person has fixated on you, he might try to find out where you live." I couldn't sleep for the rest of that week.